Okay, welcome to one of my first videos. Unfortunately, the sound is not going to be fantastic, but it is what it is. When you guys are watching this, in order to show that you've watched it, I want you to do a very simple chart, just listing the positive and negative effects of industrialization, the Industrial Revolution. Turn that into me, and I know you have done your part. Okay, so looking at it in general, this video will probably take about 10 to 15 minutes. You need to you jot some notes down. You could fast forward, you could pause, rewind, and hopefully you'll get a little bit out of this. It is a contradiction. The revolution completely changed the way people lived. Did lead to a better quality of life for most people. However, it also caused immense suffering in terms of urbanization, sanitation, education, working conditions, and labor issues. So there was some good and bad with the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't incredibly clear-cut one way or the other. Urbanization here is the growth of cities, and if you look at, I don't want to live here. I don't know these places with smoke, dirt, soot, very overpolluted. This is a cesspool here. All of the privies and toilets, all the waste went into these rivers and just filled these rivers up, and it was pretty disgusting. And you had outbreaks of some diseases that you really didn't have before, specifically cholera. Cholera is an awful disease caused by contaminated water, and it's really an urban disease. It spreads when you don't have good drinking water. And in the early part of the Industrial Revolution, you did not with some of these cities. So cholera here, if you look at this sign, this is anyone who died. They had so many deaths they couldn't fill up. It literally filled up the graveyard. So the first outbreak was in England. In England was in 1831. Came from the east. It killed 52,000 people in its first outbreak alone. It's a lot of people. It was a frightening disease to look at. You basically died of dehydration caused by excessive diarrhea, as gross as that is, and your body just shut down. Cholera is still around today. You can simply treat it with antibiotics and IV fluids that they did not have. And people freaked out when this came in. And it really gets down to water supply, which is, again, we're talking about Industrial Revolution and Urbanization. So in London, they had these cities grew so big they didn't really have a chance to get the water supply squared away, and you'd have a bunch of families working and drawing water from one pump, or you have some of these water fountains. I'm sure you've seen them. They look kind of like this, and it's a public water fountain. This is an awful drawing, but you get the idea, and the water would come in and cascade down here. Nowadays they're for show. Back in the Industrial Revolution, that's where people got their water. And if one of those gets contaminated, it could be a disaster. In one parish, the feces of an infant washed into this water reserve for this pump. Everybody that drew water from the pump got cholera. Now, also looking at working conditions, you had a big demand for labor, cheap labor, and owners with the advent of the steam engine, and they just kept these things going. People worked an average 14-hour day. All right, with only one break. This was Monday through Saturday. There was no such thing as a weekend. That was invented as an example of labor reform. No job safety. If you got hurt, they just kicked you to the curb and found somebody else. This boy here is working in a coal mine in the United States around 1900. That is soot on his face here, and normally his this is what his normal skin is, and this is all coal dust and soot. This is a whip he uses to drive the mules into the mines and back, and he doesn't look like he's enjoying himself. Here's an example of the textile industry, which was the first major industry to industrialize. And the way these worked, you had a steam engine somewhere in the plant that would drive all of these rods. These big rods would be turning. This drum would have these belts on it, and each belt was connected to a machine, and all the machines work. So as soon as you turn that steam engine on, all the machines go on. You cannot turn them off. If your fingers get caught, it just gets mangled until you could pull your hand off, or it unfortunately rips your hand off. Pretty awful. And there's a lot of disability. I mean, there's a lot of industrial accidents in the Industrial Revolution. These machines were just put together. They didn't care. They didn't have worker safety in mind. They had thousands of people for mutilations, and they would just abandon you. There was no workman's compensation. None of these. The working owners were not responsible, and that was that. You get hurt, they kicked you to the curb. They found somebody else. This guy in Germany said, a German visitor to England said that in Manchester, which was a big town of the textile industry, it was like living in an army because the people had so many arms and legs that were missing from industrial accidents. And here you could get an idea. Child labor, which we'll get into in another video. These are boys in the United States. Look, they don't have any, this kid doesn't have any shoes on. This is their working conditions, 14 hours a day, right here, changing spindles, keeping these looms running in textiles. If their fingers get caught, they get tired, that's where the accidents occur. And these kids are not going to school. They're working full-time. These are full-time employees. And as a result, you had a class struggle, the rise of the middle class, which was kind of your skilled workers, the ones that had a little bit of a skill set, your machinists, those people, professionals, lawyers, doctors, business owners. And then the super rich replaced the old landed aristocracy, these old people with titles that used to be running the show in the upper class, factory owners, merchants, and especially investment bankers, people that invest in these companies. They became super rich. And you had a really big division in the society between the have and have-nots. And these people were so wealthy, they really had more power than the government, most of them. So we talked a lot about the negative effects. Here are positive effects. You might want to pause this right here to take some of these down. I'm not going to go through too many of these, but there was some good stuff that happened as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Now, in terms of urbanization, again, this is just a slide. You get an idea of some of the pollution, steam boilers. Everything goes into this river, and this river is less a river than a flood of liquid manure, which is let's face it, it's pretty gross to think about. Now, in the United States, we industrialized after the War of 1812. Britain blockaded us, and we were forced to industrialize. We had it all. I mean, if you look at right here, that's a biggie to jot down. We had rivers, coal, and iron to make steel, and a big, cheap supply of labor, and away we went. And England was the first major country to industrialize. We were the second. Now, what allowed us to industrialize was some espionage. In England, in the textile industry, for fabrics, they had a spinning jenny, which was a machine to spin and create this cloth. It was a closely guarded secret. There was a worker in a mill, memorized what the machine looked like, and moved to the United States and built it from memory, and set up shop in Lowell, Massachusetts, of all places, and that became the center for the American textile industry. And every aspect was mechanized with these machines. Mostly young women from farms came down to work 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. They lived in dormitories. They were actually pretty well taken care of, and they sent a lot of their money back to their families. Now, after the Civil War, before the Civil War, we were still mostly a farming society, but afterwards, especially railroads, and then the second industrial revolution hit with electricity, and we had a massive boom, and really we became much more of our modern city-centered country. Now, the corporation came around. As a result, the corporation is a business right here. I want to write this one down, owned by stockholders who share in the profits. These corporations got monopolies. Monopolies where you control every aspect of a society, a business. For example, Rockefeller had every aspect of oil, from the oil wells themselves to the refineries to eventually the gas stations. Big corporations. Carnegie was a guy that had all the steel making. And these corporations work people in terrible conditions. The job of a corporation is to make money. And this is where you got some labor issues going on and strikes. They became violent, and we had labor reform as a result. The rise of these American aristocracy, Rockefeller, the Vanderbilts, J.P. Morgan, these are the super rich of the rich, and they really became the American. We didn't have our counts and barons and earls. These people became the American equivalent of that. Now, Europe followed suit after Britain and the United States. Belgium and Germany industrialized. Germany had a good railroad center. But a lot of these European countries did it by region, not the whole country. So, for example, Bohemia developed the spinning industry. Spain and Catalonia, cotton. And Lake Como area of northern Italy, silk. So they're known by the regions, not necessarily the country. So worldwide, we had a shift in the balance of power. There was competition between industrialized nations, and in non-industrialized nations, less developed became known as third world countries. These are countries that are still agricultural based, and they're less developed. The first world countries, which are your developed nations, took advantage, and this is when we're going to get into in a couple chapters, imperialism coming in and taking over and getting the raw materials from the third world countries and bringing it back into their machines and factories, developing goods, finished goods, and selling it back to the third world countries. Colonialism coming around, which again goes right on to imperialism. It's much cheaper if you just take over these countries, its rural areas, and create colonies. And Britain led the effort. We'll get into that again in a little bit later, the next two chapters, with imperialism. So lastly here, last slide, this industrial revolution took place, and we're talking about 200 years. And there were two separate revolutions, but you're looking at agriculture, production, transportation. Everything changed. Europe had tremendous economic power, whereas Asia and Africa were still mainly third world and became exploited by the first world, by the West. Every aspect of your life switched, every aspect. And really, you did have a rise in the middle class. Now, eventually, with reform, you get labor reform, the 40-hour work week and weekends. All this stuff comes about. The workman's compensation, the fact that companies are actually responsible for their workers. All this stuff does come about, but it takes a little bit of time.